Everybody. Very sad Sunday morning, uh, November 9th, 2025, because a man who was a legend and a friend, who I was blessed to have gotten to know um, for a time, was NFL Commissioner Paul Tagliabue. And I met Paul because then city manager Robert Bob well, actually, it was even before Robert Bob, but I'll get to that in a second. I originally became aware of Paul, like anyone else, so through television and the National Football League. I remember when he was named the next commissioner of the NFL behind the man who started it all, arguably, Pete Rozelle. And Pete Rozelle's background was in marketing. He created the essentially the hub and spoke system of the league, where the center was the NFL and the spokes were around it were all the different teams, and they related as one entity for the purpose of being able to gain revenue and then direct that revenue where it was needed the most. And that revenue was television revenue. There was a lot of it. So Paul became the caretaker of the NFL in the passing of Pete Rozelle. But when I what led up to me officially meeting Paul Tagliabue was that I started first working for the city of Oakland initially as an intern out of grad school at Cal. This was in September 16th of 1987. And then was rehired as a consultant the next year. Then went on to start my own consulting business because I got into a situation regarding my accusations uh, related to a city official, and that was as a rapport, that are too extensive, but it lead into what I'm about to explain next. I then became a columnist and was hired by the Montclarian from 94 to 96. And during that time, I came to know a man named Al Casal. Al Casal was the executive assistant to Al Davis. He was Al Davis' right hand. Um, and during the time that I was writing for the Montclarian, because of Al Davis and Coliseum Board President George Vukasin, I was able to be at the press conference and ask a question of the returning Raiders to Oakland from Los Angeles, actually a couple of questions, and also be in on a interview with Al Davis that um, was set up by the Raiders and the city of Oakland for the press. And so then, because of a column that I wrote regarding then Oakland Mayor Elihu Harris' ability to select any developer he wanted for any project in Oakland that the city was involved in this case Oakland Housing, because of how Elihu reacted to that and what went on after that, I was hired to be Elihu's economic advisor. And when I told Al Casal that was going to be my new gig, he arranged to have lunch with me, which turned into a succession of lunches over a 6-month period where he taught me all the NFL politics he knew and set me up to work for the National Football League, and in particular a man named Pete Rozelle. And he would talk about how Pete ran meetings, his stature, what he had done for the league in terms of basically maintaining and not, as Locasal would have put it, messing up uh, what had been built. It was very, very respectful of Commissioner Tagliabue, to me, contrary to, I think, the Raiders' public persona with this vis-a-vis the league at the time. Um, and so he also told me that there's another man I want you to know. His name is Roger Goodell. He is executive vice president for football operations. They're grooming him to be the next commissioner. And so all of that led to me bringing a number of parties together to reestablish the 49er Raider preseason game. But I didn't realize at the time the Lord had more plans with respect to me and the National Football League. During the transition from Oakland Mayor Elihu Harris to Jerry Brown and Robert Bob had gotten together and they were trying to get the Super Bowl that San Francisco was going to lose because Eddie DeBartolo and his aide, Ed Moransky, had miscalculated the construction cost for the stadium. They used prevailing wage levels from North Carolina rather than the Bay Area. The Bay Area was a full 12% greater. And that really messed up their financing plans. So Mr. Bob and Mayor-elect Brown's idea was to go, because this happened in 1998, then spilled over into 99, was to go after the hole that was left in the Bay Area that was supposed to be in the Super Bowl for 2003. They formed this task force that, even in spite of my relationship with the Raiders and my growing relationship with Roger Goodell and the league and Commissioner Tagliabue, they didn't allow me to be on this panel. So we had this set of questions that the NFL had given them. They didn't answer them correctly. I went back and did. That's another long story. And I then said to Robert, where are we with the Super Bowl? And he says, I don't know. I said, did you call the league? He goes, no, you called them. So I did. And I talked to Jim Steig. And before I talked to Jim Steig, I talked to Joe Brown. Joe Brown was executive vice president of government affairs for the league. And I said, Joe, because I originally met Joe during the time that I was working on trying to bring the 49er preseason games together. And I said, Joe, this is in Avery. He goes, yeah, I remember you. I said, Joe, I was dispatched to contact you and find out where we were. Joe says, you're behind the 8 ball. I said, what do I need to do? He said, you need to get your bid book in. So I wrote a kind of first draft bid book and got that in. That led to a series of meetings where Barbara Bob wound up putting me in charge of the effort because of the way Sally Roach, who represented SMG for the Coliseum, was handling our efforts to try to land the Super Bowl. First, she was in charge of the effort, but misrepresented her knowledge regarding our drawings because she said that Steve McFadden had stole the drawings. He was our Coliseum architect. I found the drawings and through a relentless phone call search, and I got a call from a guy named Monir Hebelu, who represented HNTB, who designed the east side of the Coliseum. And he says, Zinni, I've got your drawings. I said, amazing. He says, hold on, I need to call you back in 4 hours because I have to let Sally Roach know. And I said, okay, I didn't think that was going to be a big deal. So he calls you back 4 hours later and says, Sally Roach says you have to go through her to get them. I told Robert. Robert set up a special meeting, said Zinni's in charge. And that's how he became in charge of the Super Bowl effort. I believe that was May 12th of 1999. So, April 12th of 1999, I'm sorry. So, during that time, we were really fighting and trying to figure out how to get a hearing with the league. and I wrote a bunch of letters, and we got in the system. I created the Oakland Alameda County Sports Commission. Lee Steinberg came up to be at our meetings and brought in Scott Parker, who is his right hand at the time, who then went on to start his own uh, company as a sports agent. And then I was invited by the league to give a presentation before the Super Bowl Policy Committee. That was Neil Austrian, who was the COO of the league at the time, Jim Steig, who was the senior vice president for special events, Mr. Super Bowl, the late Jim Irsay was on it, as well as the late Lamar Hunt. Of course, Irsay owns the Colts, Lamar Hunt, the Kansas City Chiefs. And I gave a presentation that Mr. Irsay told the press was outstanding. So we waited again. We waited. And then early in February of the next year, which is 2000, I got a letter from Commissioner Tagliabue directly inviting Oakland to present its case for hosting the 2005 Super Bowl. The date we were supposed to be at his office was May 10th of 2000, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. It's one of the high points of my life. Just getting the letter and then announcing to the press that we were invited. And so May 10th, 2000 came along. It was in New York City, and had dinner with my longtime friend, fellow Oakland Alameda County Sports Commission board member, and brother from another mother, Phil Tagami, that day before. But Phil had really gotten himself in tight, if you will, with the man who wanted to be the next mayor of Oakland, Jerry Brown. And so Jerry, by this time in 2000, Jerry was solidly mayor. We went through 1999. Jerry had not met with me at all regarding my Super Bowl bid. I worked with Robert Bobb, and Robert was keeping Jerry informed. That's a whole nother story. So fast forward back to 2000 in the meeting. The night before our meeting, Phil told me that Jerry wanted to meet. Said he had some concerns. And I had worked so hard to get us to that point. I created a nonprofit corporation from scratch, even though the then city attorney Jane Williams told me, this was the year before, like 2000, it was John Russo. It was our first elected city attorney, and my longtime friend, but still, at that time, because we were met in 1991. At any rate, I really worked hard. And it seemed like the harder you work on something like that, the closer it became to reality, the more there are people who are just trying to throw stuff at you. I was told by someone that they said between white folks how do you put it? White folks who think someone white should be doing your job, and black folks who are jealous, you have a huge problem. And not realizing that I essentially created the job. I did something that, in retrospect, I remember Elliot told me to do. I had already done it by the time he told me to do it, but he said, hey, look, every time you see an opportunity for something, look at the situation and say, can I do that job? Or who can do that job? Me, right? And then put yourself in where you can do that job. That's what I had done in that case. Anyway, that night Jerry wanted to meet. We did meet after I had dinner with Phil. This was the night before we were to meet with Commissioner Tagliabue. And Jerry wanted to have, he said, you're going to raise $200 million, you say, for a naming rights agreement. That's our money. I'm talking about the city of Oakland. And I froze. In the back of my mind, I'm thinking, why is he doing this? Why is he trying to pull the rug out from under me? What am I going to do? I'm not going to have any money to build this. And then something came to my mind. I thought, you know what? I only need 22 million. I don't need the entire 200 million. It's not like I'm building a stadium, right? And so because I'm building a stadium, I'm going to have to use the rest of that for stadium construction. I only needed about 12% of it, thereabouts. And so, or 10%, 12%. So that's what I told him. And to my surprise, Jerry seemed actually disappointed that I figured out an answer. He was disappointed that I figured out an answer. I repeat, he was disappointed that I figured out an answer. But I figured out the answer. And there was nothing he would do. He was stuck. All right? So the next day comes. I arrived a good hour earlier. My friend Kofi Bonner had donated to our cause. He was representing NAR Urban at the time. Kevin O'Brien, who was the station manager at KTVU, I met at when I was invited to the 49ers box by John York and Denise DeBartolo York. That was November 20th of 1999. And Kevin said, I will do a Super Bowl video for you. And he did. He did. What I loved was that everybody got the importance of what I was doing, except Jerry. Within the city of Oakland, the best people that came up and helped and got involved was Manette Baliveau, who was the first executive director of the then new Oakland Convention and Visitors Bureau. We call it Visit Oakland now. Manette, who died of breast cancer, put her staff really singularly on helping us. We had her work culminated in a meeting we had with all the major hotel general managers in the Bay Area, 31 strong that came. And of course, there are more than that, right? But we got 31. And considering the fact that Jerry Brown at the time was not officially endorsing, yeah, you heard me. Jerry Brown was not officially endorsing my work. It took, I remember Chip Johnson, who was then a Chronicle, who at that time was the Chronicle's black guy put in charge of being critical of black public officials, columnists. Seriously, that's what he would do. You know, it's kind of like today, you have black conservatives that go after black people. That's their being conservatives, to go after somebody black that's liberal. And they generally work under a situation with an organization that is white and conservative. And they think that they're doing great work, but, you know, they're just the latest in a long line of people who are African American, who were brought in and paid money to put down somebody who's black for some reason regarding political economic issues. And so anyway, Chip had put out there that, well, the mayor's not for it. That Jerry wasn't for it, but he didn't say he was against. He didn't say he was against it, but he didn't actively campaign against it. Jerry didn't actively campaign against it, but he didn't actively work to do much for it. He did meet with Lee Steinberg, and I knew Lee Steinberg well at the time. Lee flew up. Jerry gave us time, but Jerry did not do any of the work that Lee and I laid out for Jerry. It was just phone calls. Call the CEO of Kaiser, so call the CEO of Clorox, and so on, right? None of that. None of that. I found that out a little later. It was very disappointing. So, The next day, this goes back to the day after Jerry and I had the meeting in his hotel room in New York, and I went to NFL headquarters early, armed with the cassette that was our Super Bowl video, a copy of a bid book that was made for us by GMO Hill Holiday. That's right, GMO Hill Holiday. And GMO Hill Holiday was a great law ad firm that was brought to us by Art Twain, who was a famed ad exec locally, who was the father of my friend Matt Twain from Skyline High School. Art Twain. Yep, the same Art Twain who, when I was in high school, saved me from drowning because I had a little too much wine in the hot tub. Another story. But anyway, so I'm trying to figure out how to set up the cassette device. And prior to all that, I'd also talked at length with Roger Goodell. That was the year before. And most of our conversation was about his father, Charles Goodell, who I happened to read about in a book about America that I had, American Political History. And so most of my first conversation with Roger had nothing to do with Super Bowl or Oakland. It had everything to do with his father and politics and the Vietnam War. It was a lot of fun. Again, Roger Goodell's dad, Charles Goodell, was the only Republican to oppose the Vietnam War. He voted against it. He was the Barbara Lee of his time. And so, and Barbara Lee, of course, is our great congresswoman, or was our great congresswoman, who is now our great mayor of Oakland. And so, I talked to Paul then on the phone. Fast forward back to the 1 o'clock, because I told you I showed up early. The 1 o'clock time that I arrived and to set up for my 2 o'clock. I met with Joe Brown for a little bit, catch up with him. Joe Brown, of course, I told you, was the Executive Vice President for Government Affairs. Then I went back to the boardroom and finished my setup. And this redheaded guy came out, and that redheaded guy was Roger Goodell, and he helped me set up the cassette and the video for the presentation. Everything was in place. I thought Jerry was going to show up at 2 o'clock. So I went in, sat at the head of the table. Not by my choice. That was by the league's choice because I'm presenting the bid. Jerry Brown sat next to me because, look, Jerry didn't know what to say. We tried to get Jerry engaged, to sit him down. If everything's were done right, the mayor would have done it, but Jerry didn't make himself available to make that happen. That's a fact. Jerry Brown didn't believe we're going to get as far as presenting to NFL Commissioner Paul Tagliabue, but there we were, invited. He knew he had to be there, otherwise it would have looked super bad, more for him than anybody else. So here we were. We waited for Jerry. I was ready to go. We waited for Jerry. Robert Bob was over here. Richard Matthews was on our board, was over there. Scott McKibben, then the publisher of the AMG newspaper, came. He was over there on my left. On my right, Derek Hagans, NFL Legal. Roger Goodell, NFL EVP for football operations. Jennifer Gonzalez and Sue Robachek representing the NFL on the Super Bowl issue, along with Jim Steek. All there, okay? And so we waited for Jerry. And waited. And Paul, Commissioner Tagliabue, started fuming. Now, the one thing that I figured out is you don't want to piss off Commissioner Tagliabue. Not just because he was the commissioner. Paul's a tall dude. That's the first thing that I realized when I met him that day, because that was my first day of actually meeting him in person, right? He's actually, no, that's not the first time I met him in person. That's not true. I'll get to the first time I met him. The first time I met him was when I was invited to the Wilson cocktail party the fall before, that was during our first presentation during the Super Bowl Policy Committee. That's when I first met Commissioner Tagliabue, and what struck me about him then was what I was reminded about when I was sitting next to him at the meeting in 2000, was just how tall he is. I think Paul is about what 6'6", something like that. And but he's not a person who uses his height to intimidate. He's not like towering over you. He always came across as a scholarly figure, as a brilliant lawyer. Okay, someone who could command a courtroom easily, who had a book smart knowledge regarding legislation, could explain to you the whys and wherefores of behind the history of a legislation and all of that. Okay, that was Paul. Um, I'm sure Paul has raised his voice about something as a human being in his life, but in the times that I was around Commissioner Tagliabue when he should have raised his voice, and I thought he would, like when Jerry wasn't showing up, he didn't. But you could tell when he was angry, okay, without showing up. It was sort of this grumble, you know. Well, where's Mayor Brown? Loud enough for everybody to hear in the boardroom, but not so loud that he was, trying to be um, uh, demonstrative or anything. But when you're sitting next to him and you're the person that's supposed to do the presentation, it really puts you in a trick bag. um, you know, but Paul was right, so he waited. Jerry Brown finally showed up 20 minutes later. In fact, Monty Poole wrote about this in the Tribune way back just before the 2005 Super Bowl was going to be played. Um, Monty Poole and Mike Silver also were on, or part of a special meeting I had regarding our Super Bowl bid. I wanted members of the media at my meeting to see how Oakland officials behaved, in particular Sally Roach. Okay, that's a story that led us to where we were then, because that's when Sally said, "Hey, Steve McFadden stole the drawings and all this other stuff," but he didn't. Okay, so uh, Monty in particular, Mike's always been a friend. I'm not saying putting him down when I say this, but this is a fact. Monty was always right there. Hey, Zinni, what's going on? Give me an update. He was the antithesis of Chip Jones. So, in fact, so was the Tribune. The Tribune actually gave us an endorsement. Now, you would say, well, isn't that because Scott McKibben was the publisher? And the answer is, yeah, of course. I'll take it. Absolutely. Scott was sitting right there. We were all waiting for Jerry. Jerry finally came into this meeting. He was 20 minutes late. He came with Phil. Phil and Jerry were 20 minutes late. They went to some function at the Harvard Club. As far as I was concerned, there was nothing more important than our meeting, that such that two prominent Oakland individuals had to be at the Harvard Club and make the commissioner of the NFL, Paul Tagliabue, wait. And that's exactly what happened. All right? That's exactly what happened. So when Paul says Governor Brown, because he was California governor, and the one thing I learned from the NFL through Paul, through Commissioner Tagliabue, was the old-fashioned way of politics that you address someone by the highest place, the highest position they held. So even though Jerry Brown was mayor of Oakland at the time, he was also governor of California, and a great one. No question about it. That is, it is by that title that Paul addressed him. And without fanfare, just matter-of-factly, it was the NFL. Okay. So anyways, okay. So anyways, I was saying, I don't know if you heard that, I got a call from Scott McKibben. Was I invited to be on this program. So he just left a voicemail to call him back. Um, and so I'm going to, so anyway, um, um, Paul, Jerry walked in. I have to say this and I'll make the part two. Jerry walks in. And the first thing out of Jerry's mouth after he said, hello, everyone, was, Paul, what do you think of Zinni's cockamamie idea? All right? Commissioner Tagliabue did not miss a beat. He said, I think it's a great idea. And what Jerry didn't understand was that a corporation would pay $30 million for the right to be a Super Bowl sponsor, and in our plan, have the right to take over the east side of the Coliseum and put its logo up so that, you know, on the west side, the cameras point toward the east side. It would be clear who the presenting sponsor of the Oakland Super Bowl was. That was the idea. Everybody who understood sports sponsorship loved it. Everybody, okay? But in Oakland, Dina McClain, who was the executive vice president of the Coliseum at the time, Coliseum and over the Coliseum Joint Powers Authority, once said in a meeting that we had with her later that same year, I don't get this thing called sports sponsorship. Said that. Larry Reed was sitting right next to me. Larry Reed was the District 7 councilman. Sitting right next to me, as was Scott Haggerty, who was the Alameda County supervisor. And Scott and I were getting along really well at that point. He was really excited that I got the Super Bowl. Almost was on the way toward, you know, a good possibility of getting a Super Bowl for the region, right? And Scott and I just looked at each other like, are you believing this? Okay. So anyway, you know what? Paul defended our bid. And it gave me comfort because before Paul said anything, when Jerry said what he said, what went through my mind was I felt like I was being sandbagged. All this went through my mind within seconds. Why is he doing this? You know, the Spectre race at the time hadn't occurred to me because I'm like that. I just couldn't figure out why he was doing it. And I was in the middle of this presentation, the biggest presentation of my life, and he has to do this. And that's what he was doing. He was trying to sandbag me. Paul stepping forward the way that he did was the equivalent of basically somebody grabbing the sandbag before it could hit me in the head. That's what Commissioner Tagliabue did, okay? That's what Commissioner Tagliabue did. He did not let Jerry Brown embarrass me. He wasn't having it. Paul Tagliabue paved the way for Oakland because after that, Jerry and Phil stayed for an hour. That's it, an hour. Paul Tagliabue had 2 hours booked on his schedule in accordance with our time frame. We knew it, okay? And that was when Scott McKibben came forward without getting up and said, I'd like to talk about the East Bay business community and our role in the Super Bowl. And he did precisely that, talked about the population of the East Bay, the great businesses of the East Bay, the revenue, boom, 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 boom. By the time he was done, Paul was impressed. Scott saved our Super Bowl bid. He saved it from Jerry's attempts to sandbag it. Let's go through them again. Showing up 20 minutes late to the meeting. Walking in and basically making fun of me and my proposal and asking Paul what he thought about my cockamamie idea, Jerry's words. Staying for an hour on the clock and then leaving, okay? That's enough, right? The Raiders treated me much better behind the scenes and in front of the scenes than Jerry Brown did. For example, at the Wilson cocktail party where I first met Commissioner Tagliabue, Amy Trask came in and said hello, and was very nice to me. And I didn't know Amy well at the time, but the Raiders were aware, among other things, that if I got the Super Bowl, it meant $9 million in their pocket. Yeah, that's right. That was the value of Super Bowl tickets that they would get and control. All right. So the Raiders weren't entirely stupid. And that's what the press never reported, because they, in those days, they wouldn't talk to me. They couldn't, like Dave Newhouse. We had breakfast in July of 1999, and he openly told me that I had no business running the Super Bowl effort, that they should be for George Vukasin. And I patiently told Dave, I said, Dave, George Vukasin doesn't want to do it because he's angry with how Ignacio de la Fuente, president of the council, treated him. Ignacio was also president of the Coliseum, the new the organization that really Ignacio had started, the new Coliseum Joint Powers Authority. They made it that he got the city council to vote him as chair. Ignacio was a heavy power player, sometimes too heavy. And that was one time when I thought he was a little too heavy. Okay? George Vukasin was a good friend of mine. So it wasn't easy for me, but I had to do what I felt was necessary to make Oakland great, all right? To get us where we were supposed to be. Okay? So I had to deal with that. But anyway, back to the meeting. Scott saved us. He really saved us. And Paul saved us. As did Derek Higgins and Roger Goodell, and who's now a commissioner. And Roger allowed me to become a person on the press pool, thanks to he and Joe Brown. After the city had fired, after Jerry had fired me, because I released an email to my board that said, among other things, that I felt that Jerry was not comfortable with someone who was African American, who was intellectually aggressive. To which Chip Johnson, that what I wrote in email was passed somehow. I think I know by who, but I won't go there. To Chip Johnson, he said, well, he published it and said, in other words, Zinni is saying is racist. And the answer is, yeah, I did say that. And then Jerry fired me, which is actually illegal. And it was John Russo who brought me into his office and told me that I had a case against the city of Oakland, because Jerry fired me on the basis of being accused of racism toward me. All right? So it's in that context that I got to know Commissioner Tagliabue. He is a quiet, beautiful soul who didn't act like he didn't know me afterward, was always friendly. He and Greg Aiello, another great, legendary figure in NFL that I came to know and call friend. I say Greg because Greg Aiello and Paul Tagliabue at one point, I thought so I used to think we're one person, you know? And they had a certain way of walking. It was the NFL's version of the power walk, because they were both tall. It's not something you easily replicate. Oh boy, I learned so much just being in their company about how to conduct yourself, how something Elihu Harris had tried to teach me when I was working for him from 95 to 99, and how to cultivate power. There's nothing wrong with that, folks. There's nothing wrong with that. It's something to learn. I'm going to call Scott back, see if I can get him on for around 2, and which I'll do a little later today, and gather my thoughts. Paul, for me, will be remembered as the man who saw potential in Oakland to have a Super Bowl. and was willing to help make that happen just by giving us a chance to present our case and defending us against those who would be our detractors, even the person who was the mayor of Oakland at the time, Jerry Brown. All right? And all that culminated in later that 2000 year. What happened was that we had the meeting. The meeting was over. And Paul hadn't decided anything at the meeting. We waited until it was May 31st of 2000. And on that day, it was announced that Oakland, Miami, and Jacksonville would compete for the right to host the 2005 Super Bowl. And boy, you know, if you go back in history, that's one of the most headline-generating events in Oakland's history. If you take away, for example, World Series and the Oakland sports matters, Oakland being, when I say Oakland sports, I mean Oakland like on playing field sports, but in terms of the business, right? Oakland being named as finalists for the 2005 Super Bowl got into newspapers in Kalamazoo, Michigan, right? Ventura, California, all right? All over the United States. And when we were working on the bid, we wound up in one international publication. We were in Street and Spit Sports Business Journal, as it was called then, numerous times. It really did a lot to say to people, hey, look, Oakland can be a player, all right? We didn't even do that with the All-Star game in 2000, okay? How was it different? Because the All-Star game in 2000, which was led by somebody else, who I might add was somebody else with a city who was trying to pull the wool out from under me. Not going to mention her name. But didn't even do it. Wanted to do her own thing. Didn't establish a sports commission. Nothing. Didn't want to do it with my sports commission, even though I offered her the opportunity. There was no plan for hotels. Nothing. We literally just had the game in Oakland, the NBA All-Star game, and that was it. We got little to show for it. Okay? Including with respect to headlines. By contrast, I built a website for our Oakland Alameda County Sports Commission. SuperBowlOakland.com. That was the URL. SuperBowlOakland.com. So anyway, all of this happened because Commissioner Tagliabue let it happen. It was a referendum on my work. And I'm honored that he saw what we were doing, saw what I was doing, and in his way, big way, gave me support by access. And then followed up later because as at the fall NFL owners meeting of 2000 in Atlanta, I didn't live here then. As Commissioner Tagliabue was announcing that Jacksonville was the winner of the right to host the 2005 Super Bowl, and Jerry was saying, "You can't do this. You can't do this." You know, and I'm thinking, okay, now he gets it after all this, because there were a lot of press there. And I introduced Governor Brown to the newest NFL owner, and that was Bob McNair, who bought the Houston Texans, put up $750 million of his own money, beat out Michael Lovitz for the right to host the 32nd NFL franchise. Jerry, you were talking about how Mr. McNair, who's since passed away, rest in peace, sold his cogeneration plants. Heady moment. Gary Bauer was there. Gary remembers. Gary Bauer in the limousine. So, as Paul is saying, Jacksonville's the winner, and Jerry said, "You can't do this." Joe Brown comes over, taps me on the shoulder. Actually, it was this shoulder. and says, Zenny, if there's anything we can do for you, let us know. And so, long story short, that's how I wound up covering the NFL draft. And I thought, hey, if I'm gonna be here, if the NFL is allowing me this privilege, how do I make the most of it? So I made an effort to become a media tech reporter and entrepreneur. My first 2005 account was online. In 2006, I became the first person to cover the NFL draft with a YouTube channel. In 2007, I became the first person to cover it with a live stream. I partnered with Ustream. In 2008, ESPN got mad and said Zenny is on the main floor, he should be in the ground lounge. So I thought, oh no, I was so upset. For about 30 seconds, I realized, hey, all the players come to me first and I get to interview them before anybody else, and it goes up on YouTube like that. Boom. I win. And so I built what is now Zenny 62 Media Incorporated around the National Football League. And I have Paul Tagliabue to thank for that. Paul Tagliabue is a great man in a lot of different ways. May he rest in peace and power. Thank you. Oh, there is one thing I want to share before I go. It's how Paul conducted himself at the meetings. We were at the Wilson cocktail party when I first came in. Prior to that, I was there early. This goes back to November of 1999, November 1st. And that's originally how I met Bob McNair, because we were in the same room. It's nobody else but us. And so we were there really early, then walked around, came back, the party started. Commissioner walked in. What Paul talked about wasn't small talk. It was about league revenues, ratings. And he would go to the owners and basically give them this kind of mini review of where the league was, you know. He wasn't much for small talk. He was talking about, he was consistently framing them for them that the league was growing. And here's what was happening. He wasn't doing that for me. He wasn't thinking of me as, oh, Zenny's a newsman. I was a Super Bowl campaigner, right? But that's how you continue to build the shield. That's how you continue to make sure that your shareholders are happy. That's what he was doing. All right, I'll be back.